And today we're going to talk about the treasures in our lives. Some of you don't have as much treasure to worry about. Others of you have a lot. And so depending on where you're at, this may hit home in a little bit different way. I think there's applications for all of us. But I was walking through our garage the other day, and I was tripping over these things because we have several kids, and we've accumulated things. And we actually, a few months ago, purchased some chickens, some chicks, baby chicks. And for a while, their little area to grow until we could put them out with the rest of our chickens was in our garage. And so it's this mixture of kind of leftover from that, kids' things, stuff on our shelves that's overflowing, to the point that I'm walking through and I'm tripping over stuff. And we realize, at some point, the things that we accumulate, they start to work against us, right? And at those points, we want to go through and clean everything or throw out some stuff or have a yard sale. And so we all kind of realize at some extent, there's a point when stuff becomes too much. And that's really kind of Jesus' point, I think, in what we're getting into in these verses today, Matthew 6:19 to 24. And so we're going to look at different aspects of the treasures and the things, and our tendency, first of all, to accumulate stuff. I don't know if you have any collections, if you're into collections. I used to be as a kid. I started off at 5 years old. My teachers gave out some pretty amazing stickers in kindergarten. And so I begged my parents, can you get me a sticker book? And so I had 500 different types, scratch and sniff stickers that smelled like things, sparkly glitter stickers, puffy stickers. When I was 5 years old, this was like great, right? And so I had a collection of stickers. And then I got into baseball, and so I started to collect baseball cards after all these athletes, these professional athletes. Eventually, as I got a little older, I got interested in rocks and minerals, and so we built the shelf, and we started finding geodes and collecting those and different types of crystals, and we go to rock shows, and I had a phase where I went through that. When I was an adult, it became coffee mugs for a while, so I had these coffee mugs wherever I'd go, I'd buy a coffee mug. And when people would travel, even internationally, they would purchase a coffee mug for me. And so I even had a Leaning Tower of Pisa coffee mug that was tilted like this, but yet you could still drink out of it. So I had coffee mugs. And that became, one of my focuses. It was all about collections. And it seems like in many ways our culture drives us toward collections. It constantly reminds us of our need to accumulate more and more and more things. Maybe you feel that way. Why is that? The culture drives us toward that. I want to give perhaps one answer, and this is, again, before we dive into Scripture, I want us to see where we're at in our culture and maybe why. For the last 75 years or so, the dominant socioeconomic ideology in our country and many other Western countries has been something called neoliberalism. And what that means, essentially, it started back in 1947. After the Second World War. After the Second World War, people got together and there were 39 economists, historians, and sociologists from all over the world that met in Switzerland. And they said, the things like the Great Depression, that wasn't good. Things like Hitler's regime, that wasn't good. So how can we prevent these people from coming to power, so much power, and these economic, disasters from happening? And they came up with some theories as a result of that. Largely, we would put it under this blanket umbrella called capitalism today, but this is a part of what they concluded in their document. Again, this is 1947, about 75 years ago. And they're talking about policies that enable powerful individuals to suppress the views of masses, so like dictators, things of that nature. These flawed policies have been fostered by a decline in the belief of private property and the competitive market. For without the diffused power, so it's spread out, an initiative associated with these institutions, private property, and being able to compete in the marketplace, it's difficult to imagine a society in which freedom can be effectively preserved. So they said, we want to extend freedom throughout the world. So to do that, we believe that everybody has to be able to build their own personal wealth. Because if everybody can build their own personal wealth, then many different individuals will be able to gain power by building their own personal wealth. And that'll prevent any one person from rising and taking all the power. And so out of that idea came capitalism and some other trends and ideas that we experience today. And because of that, from that point on, our society has there's been this undercurrent that's been pushing us all toward getting more and more and more stuff as a culture. Because by doing that, if several people get lots of stuff and acquire lots of power, then nobody becomes a dictator. And so maybe there are some good, principles or a good heart behind pursuing that end, But one of the things that we're subconsciously affected by, not even aware of, is the fact that we're driven as a culture and a society toward accumulating more and more stuff. Maybe in the name of freedom, but in doing something like that. So everything in our culture pushes us and has pushed us toward things like that. And again, maybe there's some positives. Maybe freedom can be preserved that way. But there's also some negatives as well. Some people get to write these rags to riches stories, and they're pretty amazing to hear about. And other people are trapped in debt and poverty despite the opportunity. Some people overcome disadvantages, and other people are limited by disadvantages. Some people and some corporations are going to get the vast majority of wealth, and they're going to have power and keep other powers in check. And most people are going to provide the labor day to day that's going to make this possible. Some governments are still going to find ways around it and have kind of capitalism, but also authoritarianism. Some people are going to get the wrong idea that money, it can buy happiness, or that pursuing wealth, that's what it's all about, because maybe culture drives us that way. And then some people are going to have to work long hours in poor working conditions with very cheap labor so that other countries can benefit from that. And so there's pros, there's cons, but regardless of that, that's some of the history and the sociology behind why everything pushes us, commercials, media, all of it drives us toward stuff, okay? And when we enter into God's kingdom, we've got to learn a new way of thinking. And this isn't a new revelation. Jesus, he was talking about that. John the Baptist was talking about that as well when they came to introduce Jesus' ministry. The first thing they said was, repent, for the kingdom of God, it's within reach. And repent, it doesn't mean, wail and confess all your sins publicly. The way that it was used in the term that was used in the New Testament means change your thinking. Change the way that you approach things. And so even as us in our culture, we have different ways of thinking. We're kind of born into it. We're affected by society. We have to shape our thinking in line with the way that God perceives wealth and finances and stuff. So Jesus is going to take us on a little journey this morning in reshaping the way that we perceive stuff, maybe a little differently than our culture drives us toward. And the first thing he writes here, he says, do not collect for yourselves treasures. Don't collect treasures, right? Be careful with your collections. And I think he says that because just like it is today, at 2,000 years ago when Jesus was teaching on a hillside in Galilee, people could still become preoccupied with collecting money and possessions for themselves. This is just a tendency we've had throughout human history, to get focused on the treasures, on the stuff, on the money. But that approach is kind of short-sighted, because when we look at the stuff, we overlook the needs of other people. And we also overlook the reason why God allows us to have abundance in the first place. Some of you don't have abundance. You live in paycheck to paycheck and you're just surviving, okay? And so maybe some of these messages are not necessarily something that you're going to have to make changes in, currently. Others of us, we have some surplus and some excess. And so for us, there's going to be some thought-provoking questions that we have to interact with as a result of what Jesus shares with us through his word this morning. But again, whenever we're focused on collecting things, we're not focused on the needs of people around us and the reasons why God gives us abundance. Why does God give us extra? This is a little more complicated than this, but I want to start off with this answer perhaps. In 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul is talking to some believers in Corinth. And these Christians in Corinth, some of them really don't have a lot of stuff, and so they're giving pretty sacrificially. Others have some extra. But there are people in a different part of the world in Jerusalem that are really getting ransacked by famine and difficult times, and so they're even worse off. And so there's an offering that's taken in that church and many other churches that the Apostle Paul, is going around between at that point in time. But in the course of that letter, 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about giving this concept a little bit. And he says this, giving in context, this is 2 Corinthians 8:13. It's not that there may be relief for others and hardship for you, but it's a question of equality. So I don't want you to give so that your lives can be hard. You can have this, deep poverty and hardship, and other people can have relief. We're not really going for that extent of it because some people were suffering. Paul's saying, I don't want you to give away everything you have so you can be even worse off and these people can have relief. But he said it's a question of equality. And so when God in his kingdom looks at giving, he thinks, what does my life look like? And then what do other people's lives look like Is there kind of some similarity, or am I way up here and they're way down here? Or am I way down here and are they way up here, to where there's luxury on one hand and there's poverty on the other hand? What's it look like in God's kingdom? He says at the present time, your surplus is available for their need. So think, it's more than just about your personal stuff and treasures and wealth. Like, it's this group mentality, especially within the church, within God's kingdom. So your surplus, you're making it available. You have an opportunity to do that for people who are in need. So, he says, their abundance may also become available for our needs, so there may be equality. So there are other times when we're going through tough times, financial straits, and somebody around us who has more money or possessions or resources, they're going to be able to help us out. So it's not just one way or one-sided. Life ebbs and flows. Sometimes we have extra, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we don't have enough. Sometimes we're really hurting. And so we need to be aware of that. And then he also says here in verse 15 in 2 Corinthians 8, as it's been written, the person who gathered much did not have too much, and the person who gathered little didn't have too little. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first off, kind of the reason behind our extra. God gives a surplus to one person or a group to balance the shortage of another. So that's the reason. We think, well, why am I doing so well right now? It's probably not just for you. God does this so we can help each other through these difficult times, according to 2 Corinthians 8. Also, the last thing Paul said in that passage in 2 Corinthians, he said the person who gathered much didn't have too much, and the person who gathered little didn't have too little. That's a throwback to the Old Testament when God provided manna, this bread-like substance that would just appear on the grounds every morning, and it fed the nation of Israel in the wilderness for 40 years when they didn't have a lot of food to access. So God just provided that. And God always provided sufficient resources. The person who gathered a lot because they had a lot of needs didn't ever fall short of that. The person who gathered little because they didn't have very many needs, or they only had a couple people in their family, they didn't have too little. And so God provided sufficient resources. And Paul throws that into this context of giving. And I think the reason why he does that is because there's a principle here. And the principle is God always provides sufficient resources. But we say, well, how is that possible? Look at our world. There's so many unmet needs. And I think the reason why there's so many unmet needs in maybe our church communities and God's kingdom among the people of God, in a worldwide sense, in a local sense, even among people in the world, is because we mismanage the resources that God gives us, right? Because, again, we're focused inwardly maybe on us instead of outwardly on other people. And that's kind of an interesting truth to wrestle with. And it's something that I'm still kind of mulling over in my own mind. Again, go back to these verses maybe later on and look through it and say, well, does that really say that? I mean, check it out. Don't just trust me because I'm telling you something. Take it back to God's word. But these are some interesting principles when it comes to money for us to wrestle with. Another thing I want to talk about here, what about our savings? Because we think about, collecting, don't collect treasures for yourself. So what about savings? Or what about savings for retirement? Is our savings account or our 401k or our investment portfolio, is that considered a surplus? What do we do about that? And I'd say the easiest thing, the best thing is ask the Holy Spirit about that, and he'll talk to you. But remember, at this point in time in Scripture, concepts like retirement, they really weren't known in the ancient world. It was a luxury that relatively few people could ever experience. And there are principles at work in Scripture. On the one hand, God encourages sacrificial giving. And we need to keep other people's needs in mind, and that's really the driving force of what Jesus is heading toward. On the other hand, you see different scriptures like places in Proverbs where King Solomon says, look at the ants. They are wise because they gather in the summer, they gather in the harvest, and then throughout the winter they have the resources that they need. And so you can also get principles from Scripture that seem to drive us towards setting aside something when there's something present or maybe a little surplus, so that when there's times that are more difficult, we have something in hand. And I think maybe there's a good balance in a story that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 12. And so let me present that to you. Luke 12, 15 to 21. Again, Jesus is responding. He's telling a story, a parable. He says, watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. So similar context. It's not all about acquiring so much stuff. You don't find the life when you get more stuff. Guard against greed. So check your motive. Is it greed? He says, then he told them this parable. A rich man's land was very productive. Very. He thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? He had a place to store his crops. We find out in the next phrase. He says, I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. So, all my storage, it's busting at the seams. But I'm getting more and more stuff. I'm being so productive. My land is being productive. I've got more and more resources. The only thing I can think of, I'm just going to tear down those barns that are stuffed. I have to build bigger ones so I can collect more and more stuff. He says, then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. But God said, this very night, you fool, your life is demanded of you. And everything you prepared, who will they be for? He says, that's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So again, very similar teaching that dovetails with what we will find here in the Sermon on the Mount as well about treasures and possessions and accumulation. So I want to throw this proposal out at you, see what you think. Go back to Luke 12 again and maybe look at that story as well. But I would propose maybe the goal of our savings, it should be to sustain us, but not to make life easy and enjoyable and luxurious for many years to come. So maybe that's where we find a balance with savings, because again, God's word gives us principles that direct us toward putting something away, not being foolish, being wise in that sense. But maybe so we can be sustained through the winter, through the tough seasons like the ant. Maybe not like this man who said, I've already got sufficient, but I'm going to build more. I won't meet the needs of the poor people down the street or whatever. I'm just going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones so, I can retire and make life not just survivable, not just sustainable, but easy and luxurious for many years to come. I think there's a balance somewhere in there. So as we kind of move on to this passage, back to Matthew chapter 6, where we started, don't collect for yourselves treasures. Don't collect for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. And so again, there's some difficulties with earthly wealth. One, we think about moths and rust, and I don't know if people do this in this day. I know my grandmother used to put mothballs in her closet to protect her clothing from ruin, and that's kind of where my mind goes back to when Jesus talks about things. We all know what rust is, because if we have any kind of vehicle or anything like that, after time, the undercarriage and then the body and everything eventually gets taken over by rust, and it's this tendency of the things that we have to deteriorate. So we have to understand that with earthly wealth, it's all passing. It's never going to last forever. And if it does last forever, it's surely going to outlast us. And so it's passing. But most things that we collect, they have a lifespan. And things deteriorate. And when we're out as a family, we have 4 little kids right now. So it seems like everything that we possess deteriorates more and more quickly, because we have little destructive forces moving around our house and spilling things and tearing up things and marking on things. And so our destruction happens even faster than yours probably. Or at least at the same pace if you're maybe in our phase of life right now. But everything, all the stuff has a lifespan. It also can become a liability. I was actually watching a video, I came across it on YouTube the other day, but it was about an actor named Keanu Reeves. He was in the Matrix series and in a lot of different movies, but one of the curious things about him is that he hardly goes anywhere with the bodyguard. And the reason why he doesn't is because he just doesn't have a lot of stuff. He lives in a simple apartment. He takes public transportation a lot. Doesn't have a lot of stuff worth stealing. And here in Laverkin, Utah, there's a tendency here in this area of Utah for people to just walk away from home and leave their doors open and things like that. At least there have been in past years. Maybe that's changing a little bit now. But I grew up in a place where you lock your doors whenever you leave your house. My wife grew up here, and so we have different tendencies. And there have been a few times when I come home and the door's, unlocked or something like that, and my first thought is, oh no, the door's left open. And then I realize we don't have anything worth taking. What am I concerned about, What are they going to take? I mean, they'll take our TV maybe or something, or some, But the more and more things we accumulate, the more liability we have. And the more wealth you have, the more need for security you have. And you feel secure in your wealth, but the irony of it is that it makes you more vulnerable in certain ways. Wealth also increases the need for upkeep. Because if you have more stuff, you have to take care of it. If you have a bigger house, you have to clean it. If you have a bigger yard, you have to keep up with it. And all this stuff, it increases the need for upkeep. Or you have to pay someone else to help you keep up with it. And it feels so freeing to get that new thing. But then you realize, I'm enslaved to it, or I have payments for the next 5 years. Wealth increases the desire for more. You get something and you feel so content. And then you see something better and you start to feel unsatisfied. And it's so ironic what earthly wealth does. It's passing. It has a lifespan, but it also becomes a liability. And we can even go to places like King Solomon's experience in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. He outlines all of his great works, everything he spent time accomplishing. His net worth in our economy today would have been $2 trillion. But even if you live like the American dream, like nobody's ever lived it before, and you're like King Solomon in our society, you're going to have the same conclusion he did. You'll look back at your life and you'll feel a sense of disappointment and dissatisfaction with the things that you've accumulated and what you've accomplished. It still won't quite fill everything. So what is the alternative? What does Jesus say? How does he teach us to approach finances, wealth, possessions, stuff? In verse 20 in Matthew 6, he says, so here's the contrast. Here's where we go with it. Instead of accumulating it for ourselves, collecting it, he says, but collect for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. So he says we can make a permanent investment, but we have to invest it in heaven. So then the question becomes, well, how do I take my earthly stuff and invest it in heaven? Can't send it on a ship up to heaven. Can't, give it on Sunday and suddenly it magically shows up in heaven. So how do I use my stuff for heaven? Thankfully, Jesus is pretty straightforward in other places in Scripture about answering those questions. And so here's a couple of places. Luke 12:33, he says, sell your possessions, give to the poor, make money bags for yourselves that won't grow old, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. So his answer in that verse is sell and give. Sell your possessions, give to the poor. Matthew 19, the book that we're in, we'll come to this passage a little later. He says, if you want to be complete, go sell your belongings and give to the poor. Same phrase. And you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And so one way to store up treasure in heaven is by selling and giving or sharing what we have to either alleviate suffering or meet people's needs, not in ways, as we've learned before, that draw attention to us, but in ways that draw attention to God and to God's kingdom. That's one thing we can do to store up treasures in heaven. Also in Luke 16:9, Jesus says elsewhere, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of the unrighteous money. Not that money is a bad thing, just that it's not like moral, it's just stuff. Make friends for yourselves by means of the unrighteous money so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. So use your money to form friendships so that one day when you show up in heaven, they'll be there to greet you. So Jesus is saying by spending money to cultivate friendships that we hope will become eternal, we can also invest in heaven. And I think both of these options, they allow for a lot of creativity and a lot of enjoyment. When you can get rid of some of the things that are really honestly you're tripping over or limiting you or hindering you because there's just so much stuff, you can declutter or you can minimalize a little bit. There is some enjoyment and some satisfaction in that. And then you have something to share with other people who are suffering, or other people around you in your neighborhoods, people that you know in the community, people in your local church family, people who are connected with an organization or in a place maybe even internationally that you have connections to. You can meet those needs and it sends things ahead to heaven, according to Jesus. Or you can look around you and say, you know what? I'd like to get to know those people. I'm going to take some of my money, I'm going to buy some hamburgers and hot dogs, and I'm going to throw a neighborhood barbecue in my yard. I'm going to invite people over and I'm going to feed them. I'm going to try to form a friendship. I'm going to go out and buy a pickleball set because I've always wanted to try the sport and there's somebody in my neighborhood who wants to play, and so it's going to be maybe a $50 to $90 investment, but I'm going to do that and I'm going to form a friendship through that. That actually is setting aside treasure in heaven. And there's so much opportunity, again, because the focus is on relationship. And through the relationships, people get connected with God and with his kingdom. And so there's so much value in that. Jesus calls that collecting for yourself treasures in heaven. So that's the accumulation that we want. We want to accumulate the meeting of needs. We want to accumulate friendships that may even become eternal friendships, not just the stuff that's going to clutter our lives and become more and more of a liability. A couple more things that I want to touch on, and Jesus touches on here. Secondly is our awareness. When it comes to treasure, we have to be aware of a couple of different things, a couple principles here at work also. In verse 21, Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So where your treasure is right now, think of where it's at. Where's your resources? Where are they stored right now? Where that is, there your heart will be sometime in the near future. And so our heart tends to chase after our treasures. And so based on the treasure that you're accumulating, that's where your heart's going to gravitate toward. It seems like to me it would be the other way around, right? Your passion, where your passions are, that's where you're going to put your resources. But Jesus says it's really kind of the other way around. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart chases after. And so maybe you want to do a little evaluation with me right now. What are your treasures? What are some things that it would be nearly impossible for you to live without? What takes up the majority of your time and the majority of your money? Maybe it's your family. Family's your treasure. Again, I'm not saying these things are bad. I'm just saying let's evaluate this. Maybe your treasure is your job. That takes up the majority of your time. Hard to live without a job. Maybe it's your phone. Can't imagine. I remember back in the day when we had these phones on the wall that were connected and tied us to places, but I can't imagine life without my cell phone with, 5G internet everywhere. Maybe it's the house. I don't know what I'd do without my house, my car. Maybe it's your friends or your hobby. Maybe it's your team. If this team wasn't in my life, what would I do with all my free time? Because there's a game on today. Not saying these things are bad, but where are your treasures? Maybe it's entertainment. Maybe it's a habit that you have. Maybe it's Jesus. But where's your treasure? What's it hard to live without? What takes up most of your time and most of your money? And then look at your heart. Does your heart just pull you toward that thing? I remember a couple years ago when there was a specific social media that I got into, and I started, checking it or looking at it almost every day at night. And I realized this is kind of consuming more and more of my time. And so I chose to delete the social media app for a while. And for the first few days or first few weeks, it was so hard because my heart wanted it. Before I added that app, I could have cared less. My heart didn't incline toward it. But once I put it on my phone and I got into it, my heart followed. And then it was hard to get my heart away, right? But if we change our treasures, again, our hearts change direction and they gravitate toward where our treasure is. So interesting concept, isn't it? Our hearts always chase our treasures. Another thing to be aware of, there's something that actually causes us to choose the treasures that we choose. In verse 22, Jesus says, "The eye is the lamp of the body." If your eye is good, which means clear and focused, your whole body, he says, will be full of light. He's using a metaphor between our eyes, kind of in our hearts in a sense. He says, but if your eye is bad, it's a bad influence, your whole body will be full of darkness. So we rely on our senses a lot, right? Our eyes a lot in the sense of treasures, maybe other senses as well, to make informed choices and informed decisions. And Proverbs chapter 4 even talks about how our senses, several of our senses, Proverbs deals with our hearing and our eyes specifically. Those are kind of like gateways into our heart. And so we rely on our eyes. If you don't have eyesight, you rely on other senses to make these different informed choices. But we got to be careful how we use them and what we focus them on, because our eyes can be good, they can be clear, they can be in focus, they can gravitate toward good treasures, or our eyes can be bad, and it's in the sense of a bad influence is what that term bad means. So if our eyes pull us toward things that aren't a good influence, it doesn't necessarily mean morally wrong. It could just mean stuff that's not permanent, that's not lasting. Our own self-desires, if our eyes pull us toward those things, we see all these things we could have, and we respond with covetousness. And that's a bad thing. But we have to be aware of the power, specifically if you have sight today, of your eyes to draw you toward treasures. If we concentrate on God's kingdom and contentment with our focus, then we're going to contribute wisely with our resources. But if we allow covetousness to cloud our judgment because all these things that we see out there we got to have, we're going to start to consume selfishly. So where are we at right now? Where do we want to be headed? What are our eyes focused on? Where are our eyes, wanting that treasure to be invested? Jesus says next, so if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? And I think what Jesus is getting at with that phrase is sometimes, it seems so right to want all this stuff, but really our eye is a bad influence on us. But if we think that bad influence is actually a good influence because our culture says, you need more stuff, you got to grow wealth. Why? So you'll be secure. Why? So you'll have power. Why? So we'll have freedom. Why? Because it's just the American thing to do. At that point, it's kind of short-sighted. It's actually really kind of ignorant or uninformed. And it's like a deep darkness because then you think that's reality. That's what's most important. Finally, in verse 24, Jesus talks about our allegiance, kind of just a final question to evaluate ourselves with. One time we were sitting down talking with a family that we knew. They had a couple girls, and they had just gotten a new puppy. And so in casual conversation, I talk with their kids because their kids know our kids, and I said, have you been teaching your puppy any new tricks? And the dad stepped in, and he said, no, they don't do that. Actually, the dog needs to see one person as in charge, and that's their mom. Their mom spends the bulk of the time there, and so their mom is the one in charge, that's importantly. And he went on to explain that dogs operate on the level of a 3- and 4-year-old because they'd done some research. And they also have this wolf kind of mentality or instinct, a pack mentality. And they need to see that there's an alpha or a top dog. And if it's not clear who is in charge, or it appears like there's multiple leaders, like all the kids in the family are teaching the dogs tricks, and so is the mom, and so is the dad, then a lot of times that dog actually wants to assume the leadership role for itself because it figures nobody else is going to take leadership. I don't know who the leader is, so I guess I'll become the leader. So if you're having dog problems today, maybe that's some just advice to consider. But he said if we let our kids and everyone teach the dog tricks, it's going to turn into a constant tug of war with everybody in the family because serving different masters at the same time is impossible for a dog. And according to Jesus, it's something that's really impossible for us, or at least impossible for us to do well also. He says in conclusion, no one can be a slave of two masters. Slavery is very prominent in the Roman culture, and so Jesus is talking into his day and age. He's saying, if you are a slave, it's impossible to serve multiple masters well, since either he will hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. So if you want to give your love and your loyalty, if you try to give your love and your loyalty to one person or to one pursuit, and you want to be all in and you want to be effective, it's impossible to do that without neglecting another person or another pursuit. He says you can't be slaves of God and money. I think we're really good in our culture too. At least I find myself trying to be really good at being devoted to multiple things. Like, I can be somewhat devoted here and somewhat devoted there, and I can, pursue this, but I can also pursue that. And Jesus is saying, just step back. Are you really loving, or are you really loyal to this one person or this one pursuit? If you're trying to spend, balance your time and balance your loyalty and balance your devotion to this other pursuit as well. And he's again talking about money and God. He's saying you can't be devoted to God and to money. You've got to choose a side. How are you going to approach your resources? How are you going to approach money or wealth or savings or retirement or all these resources? Maybe you don't have much, and so you're saying, I'm just going to spend my paycheck to feed myself and my family, and that's how we're going to approach it for now. This is probably not the message that's going to dictate the way that you move on so much right at this point in time in your life. But for others, maybe it's something where you're thinking, like God's blessed me with enough, but even more than enough. And so how would he have me use that? How have I been using that? What do I have to think through? Maybe some changes even to make. Here are some possible questions or action steps that we can take as a result of what we've looked at today. Maybe there's others as well that God's put on your heart. But one, have you become preoccupied with collecting money and possessions? Not saying that every collection is bad or something of that nature, but is that really what your focus is on? Two, if you have a surplus, why have you received it? Why do you think God allowed you to have this surplus? And he may direct you from there. He may show you. 3, describe your current approach to saving. Is it non-existent? Is it wise? Or is it excessive? And in what ways, if any, should you try to make some adjustments? 4, evaluate your eyes. Have they been a good or a bad influence lately? And how are they impacting your decision making? 5th, what is one specific way you could make an investment in heaven this week? Just a practical question. How can you alleviate someone's suffering close to you in your family, a friend, someone in your neighborhood, somebody in your community, somebody in your church, somebody in the world? What's one specific way you can invest in heaven? Or maybe even in growing a friendship or spending time on something that will allow you to create a friendship through it. Lastly, have you been attempting to devote your life to more than one thing? If so, what's it felt like? Been a good feeling? Been a struggle? Which person, pursuit, or priority should you focus your efforts on, if that's the case, and maybe how specifically? So again, these aren't 2-second answers, but just things that you can take and mull over and consider and pray about throughout this week to come. Let's go ahead and close in prayer this morning. God, I pray that you would allow us to think differently. Again, our world and our society and our culture, it drives us towards certain things, certain ambitions, and a certain approach to money. But help us to be able to sift the way that we view these things through the filter of your perspective and your kingdom and the reason why we've been given these things in the first place. Help us to be able to use these temporary resources to do much more than temporary things. In Christ's name, amen.